Bonjour. That's the extent of my French. I'm very sorry. Thank you guys for having me. I'm very excited to be here. This is my first time in Quebec. I love it. I've always wanted to come here, even as a little kid, and it's been incredible. So thank you so much for having me. I have a lot to go through today, so we'll go pretty quick. But if you have any questions, after or anything like that, feel free to come find me. I'll be around. Feel free to ask any questions then too. Okay, so. Uh-oh. Oh, geez. Oh, here we go. Okay, so a little bit about me. My name is Matt. I run the podcasts at HubSpot. So I work on 3 of our sort of banner shows, one of which is Weird Work, we'll talk a little bit about later, and then is The Growth Show and Skill Up. And as you might see in this photo, I once had nice long hair. Producer can be a vague term, kind of, and so when we think about what producers do for podcasts, it's a lot of different things, right? So we research, outreach, schedule, pre-interview, write prep docs, record, actually interview people, editing, mixing, engineering, writing scripts, questioning my life, revising everything, post-production marketing, and finally sleeping. But all that hard work, it does pay off. Right, so we have 5 different shows now, which are across all of HubSpot's podcasts. We're listened to in over 144 countries, and we have over 2.8 million downloads, which is crazy. It puts us in something like the top 2% of all podcasts, not just business podcasts, but all podcasts. So it's a very rare air that we breathe. So in doing that, I have a lot of learnings that I've come to. So some of the things I want to talk about today. One is why you need to start a podcast as a marketer, as someone who owns a brand or anything like that. Then we'll talk about the planning and creating the actual podcasts. We will talk a little bit about growing your audience, which is the #1 question I always get from people, so I'll make sure to cover that. And then we'll also get into, just really briefly, a little bit about why podcasts work so well for brands and why it's such a great idea to have one. Okay. Now, I also wouldn't be a producer if I didn't plug my own show. So the first thing I'm going to say is you should all listen to Weird Work. It is a great show. It is all about weird jobs and the even weirder people that work them. So we have everything from a international pizza consultant to a professional cuddler to an LSD microdosing coach, if that's your thing. It's something for everyone. Okay, but the real hype stuff. So when we talk about podcasting is sort of exploding. It's growing. It's very fast moving. It's kind of the one thing you're going to hear every time you read an article about podcasting. So to really get into that, the first thing I want to do is kind of just get a sense of where everybody is here. So to raise your hand, if you currently work on a podcast, have a podcast, or are in the process of making one right now. Can you raise your hand? Oh, okay, great. Okay. And then if you have an idea for a podcast and you want to make one soon or something like that, can you raise your hand? Okay, awesome. And then if you didn't raise your hand yet, can you raise your hand? Okay, cool. I just wanted you guys to be a part of it. Okay. All right, so just this last year alone, right, it's kind of maybe the most important year that's ever happened for podcasts. And it really started with Spotify when they acquired Gimlet, Anchor, and Parcast for $230 million, and then said they plan to spend a further $500 million on content. One of the other things that happened was Luminary came out, and Luminary is this VC-backed $100 million company that launched, claiming they're going to be the Netflix for podcasts. I'm not a fan. I don't know if anyone else uses it. But Google has also, during this year, started to bring podcasts into its search. So when you search for things, it'll surface podcasts for you. Other things that happened, Spotify broke out their app, and you can listen to podcasts separately in there now. And other places like Slate Magazine and the New York Times and other ones have a line item for podcasts as part of their actual revenue stream, which is kind of crazy to think about. Now, I think something that really kind of captures all of this for me is what Zach from Google Podcasts said. He said that our team's mission is to help double the amount of podcast listening in the world over the next couple years, which is the most Google thing you can say because it's so big, it's so crazy, but they're Google, and that's something they can absolutely do, and we started to see them kind of begin to do that. So when we think about who is making podcasts right now, there's really 5 different types of publishers. And when we talk about these As we start in the top line here, these have the largest audience, and then we'll kind of get smaller as we go down. Starting in the beginning here, you have like your CBCs, your iHeartMedia, your NPRs, kind of like your traditional media companies. They have the most audience. Just below that are podcast-specific companies. Those will be like your Gimlets or your Wonderies. Just below there would be like your large indies. So that would be generally like celebrity podcasts that aren't already owned by other things. So like a Joe Rogan or Tim Ferriss. Below there is where businesses tend to sit. So that's where like HubSpot would fall into. And then just below that would be where like your hobbyists, someone in their house making a podcast kind of on their own. So that's who's making it. So when we think about like, okay, who's actually listening to podcasts? There's a few things. They're commuters. They're millennials. They're people that stare off into space. If you Google anything for like podcast or podcast listener, you're going to just find images. Endless images like this. Look, here's another one. This one's on a bus. So if we pull back a little bit, we kind of like look at sort of high level what the audience is at. I think the most important one out of here for me is the 48 million. So this is US data only, but 48 million people listen weekly. That's roughly 1/3 of all Americans listen, or US people, I say Americans, listen weekly, which is pretty crazy. Now, in terms of like who exactly these people are, they tend to be millennial. Okay, so they tend to be like between 18 and 34, somewhere around there. They're also well educated. Okay, 30% have a graduate or advanced degree. And they also tend to be big listeners that consume a lot of different content. This is probably one of the most valuable segments of audience that you can find, right? So they have generally like a lot of disposable income. They also tend to be increasingly more and more the decision makers at companies. And so I think like in general, what we need to be looking at is that how people culturally, how we consume audio is changing. I would also argue that's how we consume content is changing. And right now, a lot of us tend to be more like Ron Swanson, okay, and that we like are still trying to catch up to all of this changing. So if we consider this, that 10 years ago, 94% of homes had a radio in them. Okay, now, 10 years later, 50% of homes have a radio in them. It's probably the same radio from 10 years ago as well. So I think the easiest way to understand this is it's very similar to what happened with television, right? So it started with broadcasts, and that you would tune in at a specific time to a certain channel to figure out like what that audio is going to be or what that video is going to be that you're going to watch. Then, depending on who your provider was, you could go in and find on-demand things and watch them at will. And then it then became streaming, where it doesn't matter what your provider is, you can have a host of all different types of shows and movies to watch anytime you want. That's very, very similar to what we've seen moving from broadcast radio to on-demand, which started with Apple Podcasts, to now streaming on Spotify, Google Podcasts, everywhere podcasts are. I think this is one of the most interesting quotes to me, mostly because of bias, because it's the CEO of HubSpot. But Brian Halligan, he recently this past year was on a podcast, and he was asked, it's been 12 years since you started HubSpot, okay? You built the whole company on making blogs and doing inbound marketing, right? That's great. Now, all these years later, would you do the same thing if you were to start HubSpot now? And he says, today, I might do the blog. He might do that to start it. But he would be tempted to start the company by doing a podcast, which is kind of a crazy headspace to be in for a company as big as HubSpot. So if we review these, kind of like what is the audience and opportunity here? One, it's a large, growing, and very valuable audience that we have when we talk about podcasts. Second is how we consume audio is changing at a cultural level. As people, how we consume this is very different now than it was even just 10 years ago. And also, brands must create content where consumers are. This is kind of like the inbound philosophy. It's a very HubSpot philosophy as well, okay? And audio is increasingly becoming more important in that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how to create a podcast, and also how to stand out in doing that. So I tend to think of podcasts like beers. Stay with me, okay? When you walk into a store to buy beer, okay, where I come from, we call them package stores. It's very weird. But when you walk into these stores, you have just a huge variety of different beers that you could buy, right? Now, not long ago, you would have just had your Labatt's, Budweiser's, Coors, Miller, all those major, big, huge companies that are making beer, right? But now you increasingly see more and more of these very small microbreweries with all these different types of flavors, whether they're stouts or Pilsner, all these different things, right? And I think what's important to think of is that just because there was already your Budweiser and your Millers and all these big companies with big money already doing it, so many other places were able to make beer, smaller, different types of it, and not only like have it come out, but be like very successful companies in doing it. The important thing was that they had to find their niche, had to know what they were doing and just do that well. So it's kind of the same feeling. When you walk into like starting a podcast, you can feel a whole lot like Garth when you're doing it. But I think like we'll go through a bunch of this so that instead you'll feel a lot more like Wayne after you've done this. Okay, so just thinking about podcast content in general, like it is growing exponentially. Like people aren't lying when they say it's exploding, right? There are over 750,000 podcasts right now. I think it's like 260 active ones, so it's not 750,000 active. But in just 2018, 575 new podcasts were created every day. Okay, that's a lot. I think what is good to know in this is that there are ways to stand out. And it really starts with being able to create the right show. It's no longer just about creating a show in general, having something and putting it out there. Okay, now you need to be a bit more focused in order to be successful. So we'll go through pretty quickly how to do that. We're going to start with looking at like the show level and developing that, then talking about your seasons for your show, talking at the episode level, and then at the end, promotion. Okay, so developing a show, it can be scary. Okay, starting out with all those different beers, all those different podcasts out there, it can be a lot. Like it can be a scary thing. Okay, the first thing you're going to start thinking of is you're going to ask a lot of questions, right? Like, who will be my host? What type of microphone should I buy? Do I release all my episodes at once? Will people actually listen to me? Why should they listen to me? Okay, these are all very good questions. You should have them at some point, but I think you really need to start with two. So the first one is, what makes your story unique? There's something you do or you know that the majority of other people just don't know or can't do as well as you. Okay, that's probably where you should start when you're thinking about what your show is going to be. Then you need to ask, like, why should your listener care? Okay, just because you know this thing or can do this thing, why should anyone actually listen to you or try to learn from you about it? Okay, think about that why as well. Okay, once you have those two answered, you can actually start to move forward in this. You can start to put some sort of framework and start to figure out what the format of your show is going to be. Generally speaking, there are like 7 types of podcast forms. Okay, you have everything from your traditional one-on-one interview, which would be like a Fresh Air or Tim Ferriss, any of these interview shows, to anything like your narrative nonfiction storytelling shows, which would be like The Dream, The Dropout, or like any crime podcast that exists. And then you can have things that are sort of really out there, like a repurposed content, which would be something that is, if you are creating video content already, if you are speaking in different engagements, or if you're creating original podcasts, all of that you can just pull audio from and just throw it into a podcast feed. It's kind of like a repurpose. That's what Gary Vee does. Generally speaking, like, there's only 3 that perform the best when it comes to business podcasts. That's not to say you can't do a solo commentary where just you talking to a microphone for episodes. By all means, you can. These are just the 3 that tend to perform the best. Okay. So once you've figured out what your show is going to be, okay, now you really only have to choose 3 different formats. And then once we get into those, we can start thinking about the episodes. Okay, so we got to think about, like, how are we going to release these, right? So the first way is ongoing. Generally say ongoing is a relentless pursuit of content. You are constantly, whether it's every day, every week, or every month, turning out more and more episodes. Okay, I think that GIF is very accurate to how you would feel. The other way is seasonal. Okay, so this is like you will drop very specified, either like mini-series or just a predetermined amount of episodes within a certain amount of time. This is much more of like a planning mode. So things to consider if you're doing an ongoing show. Okay, you need to know that like you can't have a shortage of content at any point. Think like the last time I checked the average end for a podcast, like we said, there was only like 280,000 that are active. All of the other ones, on average, those podcasts ended at the 6 or 7 episode range. Main reason for that was people just ran out of content to be able to make. Okay. Another thing to consider if you have the ongoing show is you need to have like the production capacity. Okay, if you're just a one-person team, that's going to be a lot of work for you. So maybe that's not the right thing to do. Okay, and you're also going to need a budget to be able to market that, and you need to maintain quality while you do it. If you're going to do a seasonal show, which I would probably recommend to start with, you only need a limited amount of content. Okay, you need a very specific topic, but it doesn't have to be a whole lot. Okay, it's a great place when you're testing out a podcast for your brand and you're figuring out if this is for you. It's going to take less time and capacity, and you want to make sure that you get the most out of this. You want an evergreen topic, something that was relevant 3 years ago and would probably be relevant 3 years from now. Okay, so you can get the most listenership out of it. I think Laura Walker's quote, she started WNYC Studios, which is kind of like one of the studios that's sort of attributed with the boom in podcasts. So the podcasts need to motivate you to think differently. Okay, if whatever you're going to make, if it's just something that people either already know or tend to just know already or very close to it, if they're not thinking differently about the topic and not learning from you in some way, then they're probably not going to care too much, and they're not going to listen to your show. Okay, so we got this done. We got our topic. We got how long we're going to release it. We know what the format's going to be. Not time to hit record just yet. I think this focus statement, this comes from a book called Out on the Wire, The Storytelling Secrets of New Masters of Radio. It's maybe the best book I've ever read on anything that has to do with either radio or podcasts. If you're remotely interested, I highly recommend it. So this focus sentence, this could be used for podcasts. This could be used for creating video. This could be used for just telling an interesting story at the bar. Whatever it is, it's going to help you tell a story. Okay, so this comes from Rob Rosenthal. He starts, he runs this workshop called Transom, which is probably like one of the most like elite like audio workshops you could go to. So what you're going to want to do is be able to fill in this sentence. Somebody does something because blank, but. If we break this down, the first thing that we need to start thinking about is the first sentence. Somebody does something. You have a character, and then this character needs to be taking an action. It's not enough just to have a really interesting subject character or a really cool guy or girl to be doing this podcast about. They need to be doing something. There needs to be action. The next part is the because. They need to have a why. They need to have a motivation for doing that thing. There needs to be a reason for it. And the last part, there needs to be some sort of challenge, some sort of friction or some kind of drama in this scenario, okay? So when we think about podcasts, like this will help you every episode if you can fill this out. This will help you have a much more interesting podcast than if you were to just hit record and start talking. Okay, so when it comes to generally like the parts of a podcast, okay, like this is sort of analysis that's taken from just a ton of podcasts. And generally there were three main things that they found. That there was inspiration, entertainment, and education as all parts of them. Now, the first thing to keep in mind is like, by no means do you need to have every episode done in this exact order, okay? Every episode you make should have all of these parts in them. I would say for Weird Work, at least, we have 3 parts to our show. We have something that's called nuts and bolts. That's like, what's the job? When do you do the job? Where do you do the job? Kind of like that part. That would probably be the education part. Then we have a second part, which is about the personal story. Figure out like, why did you get into this? How did you get into this? Why do you keep doing this? What's interesting to you about it? That's sort of the inspirational part. And then the third part of our show is we always talk about like a larger idea, whether that's about like death, love, relationships, something about there. That generally tends to be entertaining. Okay. So even though we don't call it the exact same parts, we always somehow have it. Okay. Now, after you have this figured out, you know what your setup's going to be, you know what the show's going to be, all of this, you're probably going to need some equipment. There's only 3 parts of equipment that you need. First, starting with microphones. These vary in different amounts of costs, okay? So probably the lowest end would be your cell phone. It has a microphone in there. You can go into your voice memo app, and you can just download from there. You could also buy something that's like called a Yeti microphone. It's about like $100, plugs directly into your computer, and you can use that to record. Both of these are not the best audio quality, and I think as we think about audio and podcasts, generally speaking, this kind of audience that listens now is increasingly more concerned with quality, okay? So something that would be an even better price point and kind of like what you would get from a product would be the middle. So you have a Shure SM58 microphone, which I would highly recommend. It's about like $89 to $100. And then you'll need to buy an XLR cable to plug that microphone into the recorder. This is a Zoom H4n recorder. This recorder's been around for like a decade. It's like an industry standard. What I think is really interesting is a lot of the stories that you hear on CBC come from this setup. Like, you'd be very surprised how much is done with just this. Okay, so this is probably about like $350. Will get you that same level of quality. After that, it would be something like a studio, which these microphones alone are going to cost you like $500 a piece. I would say build up to that. Don't start there. After that, you're going to need some software. Okay, so this is the one I would recommend the most. It's called Audacity. It is free. And with this, it does everything that the larger ones are going to do for you. So you could use something like Adobe Audition. I wouldn't recommend it unless you already have Adobe Suite for your company, in which case, by all means, use it. But everything you can do here, you can do on Audacity for free. After that, there's podcast and audio-specific programs like Hindenburg, but again, they all do the same thing. Audacity does it for free. Okay, so you have your microphone, you're recording it, you then have it go into your computer, you have edited the show, and it's ready to go out. The one thing I'd say is don't host your audio on your website. It's a terrible idea. It's a headache you don't want to deal with. You should invest in some sort of hosting platform. We use Libsyn, but by all means, Simplecast, Anchor, Megaphone, all of these are great options. Aside from SoundCloud is terrible. These are all great options. The only thing with these is just check your price points. They do vary a lot in terms of like how much audio you're going to be uploading, but that's really what you should check out in deciding which one you want to use. All of these will give you all of the data that you could possibly get from podcasts. Okay, it's not a lot of data, which is a whole other conversation, but everything you could get, you can get from these. So when you're creating a podcast, create shows where you have a unique angle that's specific to you. You want to develop content that inspires listeners to think differently. You want to decide if the show is seasonal or ongoing. It's a very important thing to decide. And you want to make sure that each episode has a clear focus. Okay, think about what each of those parts are going to be. Then lastly, create content that educates, entertains, and inspires. You made a podcast. You did. Now, if we were just to upload it, you might not have any listeners. Okay, you're just going to be waiting, and there's not really going to be any downloads coming in. So we're going to have to start thinking about like who our listeners are, aspirationally, who the ideal listener is. There's going to be a few different questions you're probably going to have to run into when you start to figure this out. Like, one is people might say, wait, what's a podcast? Which I have to answer all the time. It's not great, but you have to do it. Other times, you might start with people who are like, I love podcasts. Who are you? And you need to start there in figuring out how you're going to reach them. The last ones, they might say, yeah, like, I love podcasts. I know who you are, but I don't want to share your show. That's mean. They're not nice. But you might also run into that too. Now, when we talk about like knowing your listener, this is something that's like very similar to what you probably already do as a marketer. You're going to come up with your ideal customer profile. You're going to ask things, right? Like, who do they admire? What other shows do they listen to? When do they listen to those shows? Where do they typically listen to them? How are they going to find your show? Are they going to be on Apple Podcasts? Are they going to go through Spotify? Are they going to go through your website? You got to figure that out too. Some of this we already know, right? So based on just general data, at-home listening accounts for like 50% of all podcasts, okay? The next 25% comes in transit. That's either in your car or on the bus or something like that. Okay, so when building this ideal customer profile, you already know 75% is going to either be at home or in transit. It's probably where they're going to start listening, okay? The next thing you got to be able to do is make it easy to subscribe. Okay, you want to remove as much friction in that process as possible. Every additional step that people have to take is less likely for them to actually listen to your show. So you can use things like smart links. So when someone clicks on the link out to your show, it'll go either directly to a Google Podcasts. If they have an Android phone, it'll go to Apple Podcasts. If they have an iPhone, something like that. And then other general marketing tactics that tend to work when it comes to like SEO, we already know that Google is pulling that into their search rankings. So you want to make sure it's hosted on all the platforms. That's why you want to invest in like Libsyn, Megaphone, any of those places. Make sure it gets all there. You want to make sure that you also have it on some sort of web page because Google's search algorithm is crawling that. Have the transcript there so it can see all of it. Then, when you think about your social, you can have things like quote cards. You want to make sure that you're engaging with an audience. Hopefully you already have. And then you can do things if you want to have paid that you can use either Facebook or Instagram, or you can use an app like Overcast, which is a listening app we've seen really great results from. And then the last one is cross promo, right? So anytime you have a guest on your podcast, they probably also already have an audience built in. That's maybe the most important thing you should be leveraging when you do this, okay? Figure out how you can get them to share it with their whole network. Okay, so when you're marketing your podcast, you want to leverage your company and your guest audience. Again, probably the most important. Second, promote it heavily on social. Okay, you probably also already have a very engaged social, or that's one of your biggest marketing places. Then you want to start to reach out to things like a newsletter, see if you can get featured in other companies' places. And the last one is if you're going to run paid ads, you want to make sure you use somewhere like Facebook or Instagram where you can highly target who that potential audience is going to be. You've built out who your ideal listener is. This is how you can help reach them. Okay. So we've done all of this. I think the last part we should talk through is just why it works so well for brands. And it really comes down to this idea about relationships. And I think when it comes to a relationship, it really based on this sort of combination of time and attention, right? So if you create a great, fun video on Facebook, right, like people are going to see that. Okay, they're probably going to look at it, they'll stop, that's going to get their attention, but they're not going to spend a lot of time with you there. They're going to move on to the next thing, probably forget about you. Now, on the opposite side of that, on the flip side, if you create like a very boring book, people will probably spend a lot of time reading that thing, right? But you're not going to have a whole lot of their attention in doing it. Okay, but podcasts are amazing because they hit both of these things to create a really great relationship with people. Now, the amount of podcasts listened to in terms of like each episode, generally it's like 87%. My math is very bad. It could be 87 or 86. Either listen to the entire episode or most of the episode. Where they would be tuning off is like at the very end credits, and that's fine. That's where mine exists, but it's fine. So in here, this is a very large amount. I think the stat that I have is the average Facebook video is viewed for 23 seconds. The average podcast is 40 minutes long, and we see that they are listening to either the entire thing or most of it. Like, that doesn't exist elsewhere. Another thing that I also think about with podcasts is it's very similar to a blog, right? Like we create blogs so that there's a CTA opportunity that links them out to something, okay? Podcasts sort of do the same thing. They create a space for an ad. Now you have 3 opportunities in a podcast to do that. You don't have to do all of them, but there's 3 chances. You have a pre-roll, a mid-roll, and a post-roll. During these ads, you can promote things like your actual company's products. You could talk about things like a new offering you have, like a white paper or an ebook or one of your tools for your company. What we started to do is we got a little more creative and we gave these ad spots back to our customers. So our customers now have free ads on all of our podcast shows, which is kind of crazy. I think lastly, like the podcast ad effectiveness is something, again, that doesn't exist elsewhere. It's not the same. All of these in terms of brand recall, completion rate, and purchasing impact are higher than anywhere else. That could be like Facebook, that could be directly on your blog or anything like that. So when it comes to just that ad space, be creative and know that like it works really well. The last quote I'd like to read is, it comes from Daniel Ek. He's the CEO of Spotify. I think this is just a brilliant headspace to be in, okay? So it's that customers spend roughly the same amount of time on video as they do on audio. Video is about $1 trillion market, and the music industry and radio industry is worth around $100 billion. I always come back to the same question. Are our eyes really worth 10 times more than our ears? He firmly believes that is not the case, and I agree, okay? I think this quote speaks to just how undervalued audio and podcasts are currently, and then how much they won't be very soon. So, summary of the advantages. 1, podcasts, traditionally long-form content that perform really well. Audio beats almost all other forms of media when it comes to like time and engagement, and that blogs create a space for CTAs, podcasts very similar, create a space for ads. My 3 final thoughts. 1, podcast listenership is growing globally. Okay, audio consumption is on the rise around the whole world. Second one is that podcasts reach audiences at new times, right? This is at home or in transit. Generally, when people are driving, they're not reading blog posts. Okay, when people are working at home, they're not watching your brand videos. Okay, but they will be listening to your podcast. And last one, the time is now, right? Like just this past year, Apple, Google, Spotify are all investing heavily in podcasts. Competition is only going to continue to grow as others recognize the opportunity that is happening right now. So with that, I'd like to take it back to kind of like where we all began, which is that you should listen to Weird Work podcasts. It's really good. I think there's something for everyone. Okay, with that, thank you very much. Happy podcasting. I'll be around if you have more questions.